Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session, an overview intended to introduce the relationship of the Geneva Convention of 1949 to the world and the current difficulties of the United Nations to enforce the Geneva Convention of 1949 on violators, most especially, but not the only country, on Israel, which, of course, has been accused by United Nations bodies as well as rapporteurs and governments around the world of genocide since October 2023 in Gaza, and of illegal settlements, as well as the ICC issuance of an arrest warrant for a number of top government officials, including its prime minister, the current prime minister of Israel. This is a very important topic, and the reason is because the integrity of international law and international institutions, which the West created, by the way, the West created, especially with the weight of the United States in the post-World War II era. After all, the United Nations is located in New York City. And it was an American idea. I have done a session on the UN, the creation of the UN as a continuation of the League of Nations, an FDR proposal created in 1945. And of course, as we know, has been used more or less as an appendage of the State Department. And when it's not convenient, the veto power is imposed, as in this case, as we will see in the case of Israel. In the video, I discuss the history of the Geneva Convention in the mid 19th century. A group of doctors, international medics, military doctors actually, gathered in 1863 in Geneva, Switzerland. The first Geneva Convention was put together in 1864, and very few countries participated. It was a Western-based idea. The idea of the Geneva Convention was to treat humanely prisoners of war and to avoid civilian casualties, persecuting civilians, torturing, looting, any violations, sexual offenses, so forth and so forth. The question is, did the Geneva Convention of the mid 19th century apply? You have to remember at that time to just the Western countries that were developed, and at the time, 19th century, the fact is Europe had colonies. Okay, so here they are, they're introducing a convention, well intended, well meaning, and great that they did, that pertains to themselves. It did not extend, despite its universalism language, to the rights of the global south. That is Africa, Latin America, Asia, but especially Africa and Asia. Latin America certainly was on its way. There was a process of independence throughout the 19th century of Latin American countries from the mother countries, Spain as well as Portugal. So you have Latin America actually more or less on the sidelines. But the fact is, this was always, the Geneva Convention was always intended for the West. It was a Eurocentric or Atlantic centric, if you will, because the US was included. It was an Atlantic centric um, document which intended to provide some basic ground rules for in emergency situations in war and how people, human beings, should be treated, especially innocent civilians, but also prisoners of war. The 1906 Geneva Convention formalized more or less the process, and you have a number of more countries, primarily against Western, some non-Western, very few, but primarily Western countries, again indicative of the fact that this is about the colonial powers. 1906 was still not the year that um, Africa had gained its independence, nor the Indian subcontinent, for that matter, by the way, which was a British colony. So this is still a Geneva Convention about international law and humanitarian-based rules pertaining to Europeans, ignoring the global South. Therefore, the Geneva Convention was always rooted in hypocrisy. It was a document intended to protect the West, and it did not address, although later it will address, obviously now it does, and we'll see to what degree. It did not address the human rights of the entire planet, of all human beings. It did not have that kind of reach in its universal appeal. Now, the 1949 convention, of course, has been ratified, which is the form of the one we use now these days, has been ratified by all countries, including those violating it, from the United States to Israel. Among others, by the way, Russia is not made of angels. China is not made of angels. I don't want, this is universal, one standard, universal criteria, no exceptions whatsoever. This is a UN document, and the criteria applies to all without exceptions. I want to bring up a couple of issues so that we can lead up. And in this video, that's what I do. By the way, in detail here, this is a brief summary. Um, One issue, obviously, a long-standing issue, where case in point, where hypocrisy was very clear, very vivid, is South Africa before Nelson Mandela. South Africa before Nelson Mandela was an apartheid state by anyone's criteria. No matter how you look at it, it was an apartheid state, including the United Nations, by the way, including the Geneva Convention that had been violated repeatedly by the white minority, exploiting the black majority in South Africa. Yet, with the exception of very few countries, mainly in the East, including the Soviet Union, by the way, the fact is that the West, the transatlantic West, and a number of South American countries they supported the apartheid regime, ignoring the Geneva Convention until it became until the pressure built up, international pressure built up in the 1980s. Nelson Mandela was freed, and then, of course, we have the end of the apartheid in South Africa after a vigorous boycott movement against South Africa, and it became very clear it was an untenable situation, and apartheid had to end, although the white elites kept the bulk of the assets in the economy of South Africa, by the way. I want to make that clear, very clear. However, the point here is that the Geneva Convention was not observed by the West, which created the Geneva Convention in South Africa. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because this sort of double standard is currently being applied to Israel, ignoring the Geneva Convention, ignoring the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, ignoring the United Nations rapporteurs. Okay? Now, the other area, and again, I'm just briefly going to mention this, where the West had dragged its feet originally, but then it came around eventually after enormous pressure, was the repression of the Rohingya in Myanmar, the minority, the Muslim minority. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, just east of Bangladesh, has this minority that the military regime persecuted. There was a very clear statement by the United Nations and on the basis of the Geneva Convention. There was a lot of foot dragging on the Rohingya issue, by the way, a lot of foot dragging until there was enormous pressure that they must do something, and they finally did agree that there was indeed genocide in Burma at the expense of the Rohingyas. The other country, however, where there was no difficulty whatsoever on the part of the collective West, and that is the transatlantic states, Western Europe, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, no reservations, was with regard to the Uyghur Turkic Muslim tribe, ethnic minority, I should say, up in um, the northwest part of China, and the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, of course, have been the United Nations have deemed that the Uyghurs have been repressed by the Chinese government. They have been discriminated, and the West, led by the United States, which of course has a different agenda, namely to make sure that China doesn't advance ahead of the United States technologically, industrially, and overall in the economy in the race for number one spot. The U.S. led the campaign against the Chinese government about discrimination of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province up in the northwest in China, in northwest China. And here is a situation where even Israel of all countries, agreed. Israel, which of course is an apartheid state according to the United Nations, which now has been accused of genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity, was really concerned about the Rohingyas, those Muslims, but not the Palestinians, the ones right there next to them, right? This is the ultimate absurdity, and it's explained very simply by the fact that the Geneva Convention has been used for political purposes. And the reason that we have the problem that we have with regard to arrest warrants issued by the ICC against Putin, and the US and the collective West arguing Go ahead, arrest him, arrest him, arrest him. However, there are also arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his former um, um, defense minister, who just resigned, by the way. There are arrest warrants for them. Silence on that. Not only silence, the U.S. actually invited them to the U.S. They invited them to come in as guests, honored guests. So this blatant hypocrisy of violating international law and violating the United Nations Geneva Convention, which, by the way, the U.S. led the way for this, as we will see in the longer video. I invite you to take a look at the video, this longer video that I have prepared, and I invite you to write comments, send in your questions, and by all means, please sign up for this educational channel. This is a channel that Asad Ali manages. It's a great instrument for providing audiences with analysis and of various global issues and educational issues. I thank you for tuning in. Thank you very much.